Two of the most powerful men on Earth are about to sit across from each other in Beijing. And the question every intelligence analyst, every diplomat, every market on the planet is trying to answer right now is this: who walks into that room with the upper hand? Because here is what we know. Donald Trump went to war, in part, according to sources, to build leverage for that exact meeting. He wanted a quick win against Iran, something to project power, something to carry into Beijing. But the war did not go as planned. It has dragged. It has cost. And now, with the summit just days away, Chinese insiders are saying something extraordinary. America's stumble in Iran may have handed Xi Jinping the advantage. But there is one scenario, named by a Chinese source, that could shatter Beijing's confidence overnight. What you are about to watch is not a story about a diplomatic meeting. It is a story about power, who has it, who has lost it, and whether one of the most consequential summits in a generation will be shaped by a war that was supposed to be over by now. On May 14th and 15th, Donald Trump is scheduled to arrive in Beijing for a face-to-face with President Xi Jinping. The summit was originally supposed to lock in major economic deals, agricultural purchases, Boeing jets, rare earth agreements. But the US-Israeli war with Iran, a conflict that has closed the Strait of Hormuz, destabilized global energy markets, and dragged into a costly stalemate, has rewritten the terms of that conversation entirely. In this video, we are going to reveal 3 things that most coverage of this summit is not telling you. First, we will show you exactly why Chinese insiders believe America's Iran stumble has handed Beijing a negotiating edge, and why at least one senior diplomat flatly disagrees. Second, we will expose the hidden fear inside Beijing's apparent confidence, a fear that one wrong move by Trump could make China look like it sold out Iran. Third, we will map out what China actually wants from this summit, and why what they are asking for is far more consequential than agricultural deals or airline contracts. We cover stories like this before anyone else. Subscribe now and hit the bell so you never miss a breaking update. Now let's get into what is really happening. The White House confirmed it, May 14th and 15th. Donald Trump will travel to Beijing for a face-to-face summit with Chinese President Xi Jinping. That is the official line. What is happening underneath it is considerably more complicated. The meeting had already been delayed once. The reason? The US-Israeli military campaign against Iran, which began in early 2026 and has since evolved into what sources describe as a deeply unpopular and seemingly intractable confrontation. Trump, it is believed, wanted to arrive in Beijing from a position of dominance, a quick, decisive victory in Iran tucked under his arm. That victory has not materialized. As of the first week of May 2026, a ceasefire has technically halted active fighting inside Iran. But Washington and Tehran remain unable to agree on any durable peace. The Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical energy choke points on Earth, remains disrupted. A resumption of fighting is described by sources as a real possibility. And yet Beijing says it remains committed to the summit, regardless of what happens in the Middle East. The critical new development: Chinese sources, speaking on condition of anonymity due to the extreme sensitivity of the matter, are now telling CNN that Beijing views the unresolved Iran conflict as having shifted the negotiating balance. Not dramatically, not decisively, but perceptibly. And in a summit of this magnitude, even a marginal shift can define what gets signed and what gets left on the table. This is where things stand 10 days before Trump lands in Beijing. To understand why this summit is so loaded, you have to go back nearly a decade. Donald Trump's first presidential visit to Beijing was in 2017. Xi Jinping rolled out everything: a private reception in the Forbidden City, an elaborate state visit plus ceremony, lavish honors that had rarely, if ever, been extended to a foreign leader. The message from Beijing was unmistakable: we take you seriously. We want a relationship. That goodwill evaporated quickly. What followed was one of the most sustained periods of US-China rivalry in the modern era: the trade war. Tariff battles that cost both economies hundreds of billions. Technology decoupling. The US systematically trying to block China's access to advanced semiconductors and AI infrastructure. The Taiwan standoff, where each new US arms sale to Taipei triggered Beijing's fury. The COVID-19 blame spiral, where accusations flew in both directions for years. And then, in 2023, the spy balloon, a Chinese high-altitude surveillance device that drifted across the continental United States before being shot down off the coast of South Carolina. An incident so bizarre, it became its own diplomatic crisis. Through all of it, US-China relations never fully collapsed, but they never recovered their equilibrium either. Now comes 2026. Trump is back in office. Xi is consolidating his third term. Both leaders have domestic imperatives that make this summit non-negotiable. Trump needs economic wins, big Chinese purchases that he can hold up for American voters ahead of what are expected to be brutal midterm elections. Xi needs strategic stability, a relationship with Washington that does not blow up his broader global positioning. The summit was originally designed to be transactional, deals in agriculture, aviation, and key tech sectors, a framework for managing Taiwan tensions, a template for navigating the ongoing rare earth and semiconductor standoff. Then, Iran happened. The US-Israeli military campaign against Iran, launched in the first weeks of 2026, was supposed to be swift. It was not. It has pulled both Washington and Tel Aviv into a grinding confrontation with massive global economic consequences. Closed energy routes, spiking oil prices, shockwaves across developing economies. And the longer it has dragged, the more it has complicated every calculation Beijing was making about how to approach May 14th. But here is the thing that almost no one is saying out loud. China did not simply watch this war from a safe distance. Beijing made a calculated bet, and the bet came terrifyingly close to going wrong. What Beijing insiders actually feared in those first weeks of the Iran war changes the entire picture of what Xi is bringing to this summit. If you are finding this valuable, subscribe now. We are just getting to the most important part. Start with Xi Jinping. China's leader walks into this summit having spent months cultivating a very specific global image, the statesman calling for peace while Washington bombs. Throughout the Iran conflict, Xi has publicly advocated for ceasefire and pledged support for developing nations suffering through the energy shock. Western leaders have reportedly begun stepping up their diplomatic engagement with Beijing. Xi's position is not just about leverage over Trump, it is about the long game. What he says and signs in Beijing on May 14th will shape how the world reads China's role for years. What Xi wants is specific. Chinese sources make this clear. Beijing wants the United States to formally express opposition, not merely non-support, but explicit opposition to Taiwan independence. It wants restrictions on high-end US technology exports to China reduced, and it wants Chinese companies removed from American sanctions lists. These are not minor asks. Each one is a direct concession on issues that previous US administrations treated as non-negotiable. Now look at Trump. He enters Beijing having wanted to arrive as a conqueror, a president who had just forced Iran to its knees, projecting the kind of raw American power that translates directly into negotiating leverage. That narrative collapsed. The Iran campaign became deeply unpopular, its economic consequences spiraling, its resolutions still uncertain. As Xinbo, a foreign ministry advisor with direct access to Beijing's inner thinking, stated on the record, the US could not handle Iran, and that has weakened its relative bargaining position. But Trump has his own leverage, and it is real. Chinese purchases of US agricultural products and Boeing jets matter to American voters. Trump knows it. And Trump, according to one source, is very clever. Rather than targeting China directly, he has spent his term clipping China's regional influence. Venezuela, then Iran. He plays the long game too. Then there is William Klein, the retired diplomat who arranged Trump's 2017 Beijing visit, and who now, in 2026, offers the most skeptical read on the leverage narrative. Klein argues that the Iran war has not materially changed either side's negotiating power. Each side, he says, still has sufficient leverage over the other, and the war, while it casts a shadow, does not fundamentally alter the balance. Klein is a credible voice of caution in a conversation that risks becoming overconfident on either side. Take a moment away from the summit rooms and the diplomatic cables. Think about the Strait of Hormuz. 1/3 of China's oil and gas imports pass through that strait. 1/3. That is not an abstraction. That is fuel for factories, heat for homes, energy for the supply chains that produce the goods that flow to every consumer market on Earth. When that strait is disrupted, the cost is not absorbed by governments. It is absorbed by ordinary people. Higher energy bills, supply chain delays, inflation at the grocery store, the pharmacy, the gas pump. In China, in Southeast Asia, in Europe, in every economy that touches global trade. Chinese citizens have felt this. The economic shock of the Iran war has been real and immediate, even as Beijing's official messaging has stayed disciplined and controlled. Factories in coastal provinces that depend on steady energy inputs have absorbed higher costs. Shipping companies have navigated dangerous and disrupted routes. The human cost inside Iran, a country that has been the direct theater of a major military campaign, is not addressed in specific terms by the CNN source material, but the broader humanitarian weight of a war that has displaced people, destroyed infrastructure, and stalled an economy is a documented reality. And developing nations, the global south that Xi has been courting for years, are caught between energy shortages and economic shockwaves they did not create. Xi has pledged to help them. That pledge costs Beijing real money and real political capital. It is an investment in a long-term relationship. And it is one of the reasons, sources say, that China's global standing has grown during the very same months that the US has been perceived as bogged down in a war without a clean exit. You now know who is at the table, what they want, and what ordinary people around the world are absorbing while the diplomats negotiate. But remember the question we opened with? Who actually has the upper hand walking into Beijing? We have heard two very different answers. And the truth is that the answer depends entirely on something that has not happened yet, something that could detonate Beijing's entire strategy in a single news cycle. The most strategically significant reaction to watch is not Washington's, and it is not Beijing's. It is Europe's. Western European governments have spent years managing an excruciating balance, maintaining the US alliance while deepening economic ties with China. The Iran war has tilted that balance, with the United States perceived as entangled in an unpopular military campaign, and with China positioning itself as the adult in the room, a phrase used almost verbatim by Jörg Wuttke, former president of the EU Chamber of Commerce in China. European capitals have quietly moved closer to Beijing. Not through formal declarations, through upgraded diplomatic engagement, through trade conversations, through the subtle recalibration of where they stand when Washington and Beijing are pulling in different directions. This matters for the summit because it gives Xi a form of leverage that has nothing to do with military power or economic size. It is reputational leverage. The world is watching to see whether China can extract concessions from a United States that looks weakened, or whether Xi oversteps and hands Trump a story to tell American voters about standing firm. Iran itself remains in a fragile, liminal state. The ceasefire is holding, technically, but no durable agreement has been reached. Tehran and Washington are still far apart. The Iranian government, which has endured a devastating military campaign, now represents a variable that neither Beijing nor Washington fully controls. Any resumption of fighting, any new strike, resets the diplomatic clock and potentially cancels or complicates the summit at the worst possible moment. Russia, conspicuously, has watched all of this from the margins. Moscow and Beijing share a general interest in a weakened American global posture, but Russia's own isolation since its Ukraine invasion limits how openly it can engage with either side. The picture that emerges is not of a world rushing to congratulate the summit. It is of a world holding its breath, watching to see whether the two largest powers can produce something stable, or whether the next 2 weeks produce a new crisis instead. Here is the part that most headlines are burying entirely. Beijing is not approaching the summit from a position of pure confidence. Beneath the carefully managed public posture, Xi calling for peace, China as the stability anchor, the winning without fighting narrative, there is a documented fear that came very close to upending everything. A Chinese foreign ministry advisor named Xinbo states it explicitly in the CNN source material. Quote, "We were very worried when the war first broke out, not just for our oil and business interests in the Middle East. We were concerned that if Iran couldn't hold up, a pro-West regime could emerge, and then it wouldn't be good for China's interests." Let that sit for a moment. China's strategic confidence. The current situation has turned out to be favorable to China framing is not the product of a plan that went right. It is the product of a disaster that did not happen. If Iran had collapsed quickly, if Washington and Tel Aviv had installed a government in Tehran more amenable to Western interests, if the Strait of Hormuz had reopened on American terms, China's negotiating position would not look like it does today. It would be dramatically weaker. This is not a minor footnote. It fundamentally changes the character of Xi's confidence heading into the summit. He is not confident because he executed a masterful strategy. He is confident because the US failed to execute its strategy as planned. And there is a second hidden layer. A Chinese source raises an explosive scenario directly. If Trump attacks Iran after visiting China, it would appear to the world as if Beijing had abandoned its close partner. China's regional credibility, in the Middle East, across the developing world, would take a serious and potentially lasting hit. In other words, Beijing's leverage over this summit is real, but it is hostage to Trump's next decision on Iran. One airstrike after Air Force One leaves Beijing, and the narrative reverses overnight. You now know something that the confident China wins the Iran war narrative leaves out. Beijing's strength is built on American failure, not Chinese mastery, and it expires the moment Trump decides the Iran chapter is not actually over. What comes next is the part analysts are spending their days gaming out, because the scenarios for what happens at this summit and what happens after it are not abstract. They are specific, and at least one of them reshapes the global order for a decade. Let us be precise about what is actually at stake in Beijing on May 14th and 15th. On the geopolitical dimension, Taiwan, the most dangerous flashpoint in the world, China wants the United States to formally oppose Taiwan independence, not just maintain studied ambiguity, but shift its stated position. If Trump gives ground on Taiwan in exchange for economic wins, the implications ripple outward to every U.S. ally in the Indo-Pacific. Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, all of them are calibrating their own postures based on how Washington draws that line. A softened U.S. stance on Taiwan independence does not just affect Taiwan. It reshapes the security architecture of the entire region. On the technology dimension, semiconductor export restrictions. The United States has spent several years systematically trying to deny China access to the most advanced chips and AI hardware. These restrictions are central to the long-term competition between the two powers. If Trump eases them in exchange for agricultural purchases and Boeing orders, the kind of transactional optics he needs for domestic political reasons, he may be trading a strategic long-term advantage for a short-term headline. On the economic dimension, rare earth supply chains. China dominates the global production and processing of rare earth elements, the materials without which modern electronics, electric vehicles, and defense systems cannot be built. This is leverage Beijing has not yet fully deployed. The threat of restricting rare earth exports to the US is a card that, if played, would immediately and severely damage American manufacturing and military production. Both sides know it. The question is whether the summit produces a framework that makes that card unnecessary to play, or whether the talks collapse and Beijing decides the moment has come. On the human dimension, the Strait of Hormuz. Every day it remains disrupted, energy costs rise, supply chains strain, and economies in the developing world edge closer to crisis. A summit that produces genuine stability could unlock conditions for the strait's full reopening. A summit that fails, or that is followed by resumed fighting in Iran, could mean months more of those costs cascading across the global economy. The worst case is not a summit that produces nothing. The worst case is a summit that produces a false sense of progress, a photo opportunity without substance, followed by a resumption of the Iran conflict that makes Beijing look complicit in whatever comes next. Three voices from the source material offer a genuine range of analytical positions, and it is worth listening to all three because they do not agree. Xinbo, a Foreign Policy Advisory Committee member of the Chinese Foreign Ministry and director of the Center for American Studies at Fudan University in Shanghai, is the most direct. He argues that the Iran war has demonstrably weakened America's bargaining position. He specifically says the US simply couldn't handle Iran, and that as a consequence, Trump enters Beijing with less relative leverage than he would have had if the campaign had been swift and decisive. Wu is not a fringe analyst. He is embedded in the institutional architecture of China's foreign policy thinking. His view reflects how at least a significant portion of Beijing's inner circle is reading this moment. Cui Hongjian, former diplomat and international affairs scholar at Beijing Foreign Studies University, takes a structural view. He argues that China-US relations are Beijing's top priority, and that the Iran crisis has made navigating that priority significantly more complicated. He frames the summit not as an opportunity China is trying to exploit, but as a necessity China is trying to manage under difficult conditions. This is a more cautious read, one that frames Beijing as a reluctant actor pulled into a crisis it did not seek. William Klein offers the most skeptical American perspective. Klein arranged Trump's 2017 Beijing visit. He understands the mechanics of how these summits work. And his conclusion? The Iran war has not materially changed the leverage equation. Each side still holds sufficient power over the other. Neither has been strengthened or weakened in a way that changes the fundamental negotiating architecture. Klein's caution is notable precisely because it resists the narrative that the Iran war has been a decisive inflection point. That narrative, he implies, may be more useful to Beijing's messaging than it is accurate as a strategic assessment. The honest answer is that all three are partially right. The war has shifted perceptions and atmospherics. Whether it has shifted actual leverage depends on the next 10 days. We have now heard what Chinese insiders believe, what American analysts think, what the diplomats are calculating, and what the ground reality looks like for the people absorbing the cost of all of this. Here is what we still do not know. We do not know whether Trump walks into Beijing as a man who has accepted that Iran did not go according to plan, or as a man who is still trying to salvage something from it. That distinction may be the single most important variable in what comes out of May 14th and 15th. And the scenarios for what comes next are not equally likely. Best case, a genuine framework emerges from the Beijing summit. China makes substantial, verifiable commitments on agricultural purchases and Boeing aircraft orders, giving Trump a tangible domestic win. The US signals a more stable position on tech export restrictions, enough to give Beijing confidence without abandoning strategic competition entirely. Both sides agree on language around Taiwan that is ambiguous enough for each to claim as a victory. Meanwhile, US-Iran talks produce enough progress that the Strait of Hormuz is fully reopened within weeks. Energy markets stabilize. Global supply chains begin to recover. This outcome requires both Trump and Xi to accept less than they want, which is why it is the best case and not the likely one. Likely case, the summit produces agreements that are more symbolic than structural. Big numbers get announced: Chinese purchases, joint working groups, commitments to continued dialogue. Xi gets the optics of a successful meeting and the narrative of Chinese statesmanship. Trump gets a headline to carry into the 2026 midterms. But the hard questions, Taiwan, technology restrictions, the sanctions list, are deferred to future rounds of talks. Iran remains an open wound. The Strait of Hormuz situation stays fragile. The fundamental competition between the two powers continues, now wrapped in the language of managed coexistence. This is the most historically consistent outcome, and the incentive structures on both sides point here. Worst case, the summit collapses or produces a breakdown in trust. Either Trump, feeling he has too little leverage, makes demands Beijing cannot publicly accept, or Xi, reading Trump as weakened, overreaches and asks for Taiwan concessions that cross a domestic American political line Trump cannot afford to cross before the midterms. The meeting ends without a joint statement. Or worse, Trump, under domestic political pressure, resumes military pressure on Iran after returning from Beijing, and China's nightmare scenario plays out. Beijing looks like it hosted a man who then immediately bombed its partner. China's credibility with Iran, with the Middle East, with the developing world, all of it takes a blow. US-China relations enter a new and more dangerous phase. This is the scenario that keeps Chinese sources up at night. I want to put two questions directly to you, and I mean these as genuine questions, not rhetorical ones. There is no obvious right answer to either of them. First, if Trump does soften America's position on Taiwan independence in exchange for Chinese economic concessions, agricultural deals, airline contracts, headline numbers, does that trade represent pragmatic statecraft, or is it a strategic mistake that America will spend a generation paying for? The argument for tangible economic wins now, reduced risk of conflict. The argument against Every U.S. ally in the Indo-Pacific has to recalculate their relationship with Washington overnight. Second, China's global reputation has genuinely grown during this Iran war, but that reputation is built on not having fought. Is that sustainable? Is a power that wins by staying out of conflict actually stronger? Or does the moment eventually arrive when standing aside becomes indistinguishable from irrelevance? Drop your answers in the comments. I read them. This conversation matters. Here are the 3 things you should carry out of this video. 1. Beijing's confidence heading into the May 14th summit is real, but it is not built on Chinese mastery. It is built on American failure in Iran. The war did not go as Washington planned, and the gap between what Trump wanted to project and what he actually achieved has handed Xi a psychological, if not material, advantage. Whether that translates into concrete concessions remains the open question. 2. China's strategy is coherent but fragile. Everything Beijing has built, the image of the stability anchor, the credibility with developing nations, the winning without fighting narrative, collapses instantly if Trump resumes military pressure on Iran after the summit. Chinese sources acknowledge this fear directly. It is the sword hanging over Beijing's apparent confidence. 3. The hardest issues on the table, Taiwan, semiconductor restrictions, the sanctions list, are not going to be resolved in 2 days in Beijing. The most likely outcome is a framework of managed coexistence dressed up as a breakthrough. What matters is whether the agreements made are real enough to hold and specific enough to verify. Watch 3 things in the coming days. Watch whether Washington and Tehran reach any durable agreement before May 14th. That changes Trump's leverage dramatically. Watch whether Beijing officially confirms the summit dates, which it had not yet done as of early May. And watch what happens in the Strait of Hormuz, because the energy markets will tell you, in real time, what the diplomats are actually deciding. This story is not over. What happens in the next 10 days inside those summit rooms could reshape the US-China relationship for the rest of this decade. Subscribe and hit the bell, because when it breaks, we will be the first to cover it. The United States went to war to build leverage. Whether it walks out of Beijing with any is the question that will define 2026.